In the vast, devastating landscape of the Second World War, entire nations rose and fell, armies clashed across continents, and the world witnessed destruction on a scale unimagined before. But beyond the famous battles and political leaders, far from the war rooms and the front lines, there existed another war, a quieter one, an invisible one, fought in the shadows by individuals whose stories were never meant to be told. Among them were the women of Japan. For decades, the official narrative of Imperial Japan during World War II focused on its military campaigns, its political ambitions, and its male-dominated hierarchy. But beneath this structure lived a hidden network of women wives, students, nurses, factory workers, aristocrats, clerks whose lives became intertwined with espionage, resistance, survival, and sacrifice. Some worked willingly, some acted under pressure, some had no choice at all, and some risked everything to oppose the very empire they lived under. This is the untold story of Japanese women whose secret mission shaped the war in ways history has rarely acknowledged. Their battlefield was not the front line. It was the quiet corridor, the coded message, the hidden room, the midnight delivery, the stolen document, the whispered conversation. Today, we uncover the truth behind the shadows. This is Spycraft, survival, sacrifice, the secret missions of Japanese women in World War II. To understand the role Japanese women played during the war, we must first understand the world they lived in. Pre-war Japan was a nation steeped in tradition and hierarchy. For centuries, women were taught to embody good wife, wise mother, Ryosui Kenbo, a principle that shaped every expectation placed on them. Obedience to the family, devotion to the household, loyalty to the nation. When war erupted in 1937 with the invasion of China, and later in 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan's demands on its citizens intensified. Women were mobilized into factories, schools, military hospitals, and civil defense units. Their roles expanded, yet remained uncredited, overshadowed, and often invisible. But within this rigid structure, a new reality emerged. The empire urgently needed information. It needed eyes. It needed ears. And women, often overlooked, underestimated, and ignored by male officials, became ideal instruments. This environment laid the groundwork for clandestine activities few could have predicted. By the early 1940s, Japanese intelligence agencies, including the Kempeitai military police, the Tok Special Hire Police, and various naval and army intelligence branches, began to see the strategic value of deploying women. Women could move through social spaces men could not. They were less likely to be searched at checkpoints. They blended into crowds, hospitals, schools, markets, and even foreign communities. Many were university students studying languages like English, Russian, and Chinese. Others were trained nurses, traveling with military units to occupied territories. Some were secretaries placed inside diplomatic circles. A few came from elite families, whose connections opened doors in international business and politics, but the most effective agents, often, they were ordinary women with extraordinary circumstances. Some were recruited, some were coerced, some volunteered to support the war effort, and some, quietly, used their positions to resist it. The creation of these female networks happened quietly, without public recognition. Yet their influence stretched across East Asia, from Tokyo to Shanghai, from Manila to Singapore, from Korea to Southeast Asia. And within these networks, three categories of missions emerged: information gathering, covert operations, and survival-based espionage. Over the next chapters, we explore each through true historical cases, stories buried for decades in archives, testimonies, and forgotten reports. As Japan expanded its military presence across Asia, one of its most urgent needs was communication. Languages like English and Chinese became critical for deciphering captured documents, interrogating prisoners, monitoring foreign radio broadcasts, and infiltrating international communities. This need gave rise to a new class of women, the wartime linguists. University students turned intelligence assets. In the late 1930s, thousands of young women were attending elite Japanese universities, an educational opportunity that had only recently expanded for women. Many specialized in foreign languages, unaware that these skills would draw government attention. By 1942, the military began recruiting women directly from campuses. Some were told they would serve the nation through translation. Others were not told anything at all. They were simply assigned. Women fluent in English, Russian, or Chinese found themselves working in hidden rooms, behind government offices, decoding intercepted messages or translating foreign newspapers and military reports. Their work was not glamorous. It was long, monotonous, and secretive, but it was vital. The case of Miyako, the translator who never spoke of her war. One such woman was Miyako, a university student whose English proficiency was exceptional. Recruited at 21, she spent the war passing Allied broadcasts, listening for troop movements, supply shortages, and political shifts. She worked in silence 4 years. No one, not even her parents, knew what she did. After the war, when asked about her role, she said only, "I translated words I did not wish to understand." Her story reflects thousands of women whose intellectual contributions have been largely erased from history. Throughout the Pacific, Japanese military hospitals were staffed heavily by women, trained nurses, volunteers, students, and members of organizations like the Japanese Red Cross. Officially, their role was medical. Unofficially, many became sources of high-value intelligence. Hospitals as information hubs, wounded soldiers talked. Captured prisoners talked. Foreign civilians seeking treatment talked. Nurses heard everything, and the military knew it. The Kempeitai routinely used nurses to gather personal details about prisoners, verify identities, and report any suspicious conversations within wards. Sometimes, the women did so willingly out of patriotism. Sometimes, they acted out of fear. Sometimes, they did not even realize they were being used. Nurses in occupied territories. In regions like China, Korea, Singapore, and the Philippines, Japanese nurses were often stationed near front lines. They witnessed the brutal realities of occupation, atrocities, suffering, and the collapse of civilian life. A few participated, others resisted silently. Many simply tried to survive. Some became intermediaries between local populations and Japanese officers, navigating dangerous moral landscapes where a single misinterpreted word could cost a life. These women lived in constant tension between their duty to heal and the demands of a ruthless war machine. Not all espionage required infiltration. Some came naturally through social privilege. Women from wealthy, politically connected families often became conduits of information without realizing they were being used as intelligence assets. Their homes hosted officials, diplomats, foreign businessmen, and military officers. Conversations flowed freely in these social spaces, and women were expected to be present, but silent, yet silence did not mean ignorance. The case of Lady Ayam, the hostess who knew too much. Ayam, the daughter of a Tokyo industrial magnate, was known for hosting high-level gatherings during the early war years. She spoke fluent English and French, and her home became a meeting space for both Japanese leaders and foreign representatives. As war intensified, the Kempeitai quietly monitored her events, using attendants to gather information. Ayam was never formally recruited, but she knew her home had become a listening post. Though not a spy in the traditional sense, her life demonstrates how Japanese women, especially those in elite circles, became unwitting participants in a vast intelligence ecosystem. Not every woman who entered the world of wartime espionage did so willingly. In fact, many were coerced, threatened, or manipulated into serving the intelligence demands of a state that allowed no refusal. The Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police, operated with absolute authority. Across occupied territories, they recruited informants, spies, and assistants through intimidation. Many of these conscripts were women who had lost families, homes, or livelihoods in the chaos of war. For these women, espionage was not a mission. It was a sentence. Women in occupied territories. As Japanese forces advanced through China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, they left behind complex local societies marked by fear, survival, and resistance. Some women were pressured into working as informants because their villages depended on Japanese supplies. Others were threatened with imprisonment, loss of family members, or worse. The Kempeitai used psychological pressure, manipulation, and sometimes outright violence. Case study: the schoolteacher of Manila. One documented account speaks of a young Japanese Filipino schoolteacher living in Manila. When the occupation began, she was approached by Japanese authorities because she spoke both languages fluently. At first, she refused, but after a fabricated accusation against her brother, she was forced to comply. Her tasks were simple yet dangerous: report anti-Japanese sentiment among students, identify possible resistance sympathizers, monitor foreign families with connections to Allied forces. She lived in silence, trapped between loyalty to her heritage and fear for her family's lives. After the war, she never spoke publicly about her wartime role. Her story, like many others, remains buried in the complicated moral landscape of occupied territories. Women in domestic coercion. Inside Japan itself, coercion took on a different form. Women were pressured not by foreign occupation, but by nationalist propaganda, community leaders, and military officials. Neighborhood units, known as tonarigumi, monitored citizens closely. If a woman refused to cooperate with intelligence requests, she risked social isolation, denunciation, or suspicion of treason. For these women, espionage was less about secret missions and more about forced participation in a surveillance society. These coerced operatives remind us that wartime espionage was not always heroic or voluntary. Sometimes, it was simply a matter of staying alive. One of the least understood aspects of World War II intelligence is the presence of Japanese women who secretly acted against the Empire, sometimes for the Allies, sometimes for local resistance groups, and sometimes for their own survival. These double agents operated in a moral no-man's land. They walked a tightrope where a single misstep meant execution. Women torn between identities. Some were born abroad, Japanese daughters raised in Hawaii, California, or Singapore, who found themselves trapped in enemy territory when war began. Their bilingual abilities made them valuable to both sides. Others were women who disagreed with Japanese militarism and used their positions to help local populations, sabotage military activities, or pass information to opposition groups. Case study: the Shanghai informant. One of the most intriguing examples comes from Shanghai, a city teeming with spies from every major world power. A young Japanese woman, the daughter of a businessman, used her social connections to collect intelligence. She attended elite gatherings frequented by Japanese officers, German advisors, Chinese officials, and foreign diplomats. Outwardly, she appeared loyal to Japan, but secretly, she had aligned herself with a Chinese underground network. Her method was subtle: observing officer conversations, tracking shipments and troop movements, passing coded messages disguised as business correspondence. Her double life lasted 4 years, astonishingly long by wartime standards. After the war, her contributions were quietly noted by Allied intelligence, but her identity remained sealed to protect her from retaliation. Double agents within Japan. Even inside Japan, some women quietly resisted the regime. These included pacifist students, Christian women's groups, intellectual circles, individuals connected to dissident political families. They helped hide draft dodgers, sheltered persecuted neighbors, and shared information about air raids or military plans with underground networks. Though their actions were small compared to traditional spycraft, they were acts of defiance in a nation where dissent was nearly impossible. These double agents represent a rarely acknowledged truth. Not all Japanese women supported the war, and some risked everything to oppose it. The idea of Japanese resistance during World War II challenges popular assumptions. Japan is often portrayed as a society of unanimous wartime support, but the reality was far more complex. Within Japan's borders were pockets of quiet resistance, small groups and individuals who opposed militarism, questioned the war, or tried to protect civilians from the harsh reality of state control. Many of the most effective members of this resistance were women. The quiet rebellion of students, university campuses became centers of silent defiance. Although student activism was heavily restricted, some professors and female students formed informal discussion groups where they exchanged forbidden foreign texts, debated democracy, and criticized the government. They shared censored information, allied radio broadcasts, underground pamphlets, early reports of Japanese defeats, accounts of brutalities in occupied territories. These women were not spies in the traditional sense, but they distributed truth in a society built on controlled narratives. For the regime, that alone was subversion. Nurses who resisted. Within military hospitals, some nurses subtly sabotaged brutal interrogation practices. They hid prisoners marked for execution, passed small messages to detainees, or falsified medical records to spare captives from torture. These acts required extraordinary courage. The Kempeitai were notorious for punishing even minor infractions. One nurse later testified anonymously that every time she misreported a prisoner's condition to protect him, she expected to die. Mothers saving lives in bombing raids. As Allied air raids intensified, mothers and grandmothers across Japan became unofficial leaders of neighborhood survival efforts. Some defied government evacuation orders, saving children from being sent to dangerous rural labor camps. Others refused to hand over teen boys targeted for last-minute military conscription. Their resistance was rooted in maternal instinct, but in wartime Japan, protecting your children from the state was a subversive act. Clerks and secretaries, leaks from within. Women employed in government offices occasionally smuggled out critical documents, such as casualty numbers the government hid, supply shortages, evidence of corruption. Falsified reports meant to create illusions of victory. Some shared these with family members in the military. Others leaked them to underground networks or foreign contacts. Each act challenged the rigid structure of an authoritarian wartime state. Many Japanese women who became involved in espionage received no formal intelligence training. No codebooks, no psychological preparation, no escape protocols. Their skills emerged from daily life, intuition, observation, caution, and adaptability. Some learned to memorize patterns of troop movements while carrying water. Some learned to listen while pretending to clean rooms. Some learned to hide messages in hairpins, hems, and handwritten recipes. Wartime survival taught them the art of deception. Improvised techniques used by women across Asia, sewing coded stitches into clothing, hiding micronotes inside tea canisters, using flower arrangements to signal resistance members, passing information through seemingly innocent household letters, spreading misinformation to confuse occupying forces. These were not cinematic spy operations. They were clever, improvised, everyday acts. And yet, these untrained women created intelligence that shaped military decisions, saved lives, and revealed truths hidden from the public. As Japan pushed deeper into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the nature of women's involvement in the war shifted dramatically. The front was no longer distant, it was everywhere. Islands once peaceful became strategic battlegrounds, and towns that had never known warfare found themselves under military occupation. And in these turbulent spaces, Japanese women became central figures in communication, supply networks, and covert operations. Women in Singapore and Malaya. After capturing Singapore in 1942, the Gibraltar of the East, Japan established a harsh military administration. Japanese women stationed there served as nurses, clerical workers, and civil supervisors. Some were transported from Japan under the Women's Volunteer Corps. Others arrived with businessmen and bureaucrats. Their proximity to Southeast Asian communities placed them in unique positions. They overheard local rumors. They interacted with merchants and traders. They moved freely through markets, hospitals, and social clubs. As a result, Japanese intelligence units often leaned on women to gather small fragments of information that, when pieced together, gave insights into local resistance movements. Some women cooperated willingly. Others resisted quietly by withholding information or warning locals about impending searches. Women on the home islands supporting the Pacific Front. Even far from the Pacific Islands, Japanese women on the home front became part of the war's intelligence machinery. They stitched parachutes, inspected shells, and monitored incoming Allied radio broadcasts. In remote fishing villages, women were instructed to report unfamiliar ships or aircraft. In port towns, female workers watched foreign sailors and merchants. This vast, informal network blurred the line between civilian life and state intelligence. In Japan, espionage was no longer practiced only by trained agents. It became part of daily life. The Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police, cast a long shadow over every territory they controlled. Their methods, surveillance, interrogation, torture, and execution became synonymous with terror. Yet in that atmosphere of fear, many Japanese women quietly defied the Kempeitai. Their defiance was rarely open and never safe. But it existed, women protecting civilians. In occupied cities such as Nanjing, Seoul, Taipei, and Manila, Japanese nurses and clerks sometimes warned local civilians about raids, arrests, or impending executions. A nurse in Nanjing risked death by secretly giving water and bandages to Chinese civilians threatened by Japanese patrols. A clerk in Seoul destroyed lists of suspected resistance sympathizers before they reached Kempeitai officers. In Taipei, a schoolteacher intercepted a letter that would have condemned a family and quietly burned it. These subtle acts, often invisible in wartime records, were nonetheless powerful statements of humanity. Women opposing domestic surveillance. Inside Japan, ordinary women had to navigate the oppressive atmosphere enforced by the Kempeitai. Speaking against the war even privately could lead to arrest. Still, some women formed circles of quiet opposition, reading banned books, listening to Allied broadcasts, sharing uncensored news, questioning propaganda narratives. One professor's daughter kept a hidden diary for 3 years, documenting Japanese defeats she heard through forbidden BBC broadcasts. Had she been caught, she would have disappeared into a Kempeitai prison. Her diary survived the war, she did, too, but just barely. The stories of these women reveal something essential. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes, courage is the refusal to look away. Women across Asia became the lifeline of resistance networks by performing one of the most dangerous tasks in wartime, carrying messages. A single sheet of paper could mean life or death. A single word misheard could destroy an entire network. Yet women, Japanese and local alike, took on this mission with remarkable resolve. The messenger girls of Manchuria. In Manchukuo, Japan's puppet state in northeastern China, young women employed in post offices and telegraph stations were often pressured into reporting suspicious communications. But some did the opposite. They redirected Japanese intelligence reports to Chinese resistance units, intercepted sensitive letters, or delayed messages to sabotage Japanese operations. They were never trained, they simply acted on instinct and belief. Women in rural Japan carrying hidden messages. In Japan's countryside, where the war's final years brought starvation and desperation, women played roles rarely documented. Some carried handwritten notes between families hiding deserters. Others transmitted whispered warnings about police patrols, conscription raids, or supply seizures. These acts were small in scale, but revolutionary in principle. The housewife who became a spy in Burma. One extraordinary account involves a Japanese homemaker in Burma, whose husband worked as a liaison officer. While he supported the military regime, she developed sympathy for Burmese locals suffering under occupation. Using her status as an officer's wife, she gained access to restricted zones, listening quietly during social gatherings. She memorized troop movements, ammunition shortages, and the timing of Japanese road patrols. She passed this information to Burmese resistance members using coded fabric patterns she hung outside her home. After the war, she vanished from public record, presumably to avoid being labeled a traitor. One of the most complicated aspects of women's involvement in wartime espionage is the emotional dimension, the intersection of loyalty, love, fear, and betrayal. Some women were caught between nations, some between families, some between personal morals and patriotic expectations. Japanese women married to foreign men. Before the war, many Japanese women married European, American, or Chinese husbands. When hostilities began, their lives changed instantly. They became potential targets of suspicion, yet also potential intelligence assets. A Japanese woman married to a British engineer in Hong Kong found herself interrogated by both sides. She used her position to pass food, medicines, and small notes to Allied posts, and to mislead Japanese officers about her husband's contacts. Her bravery saved dozens of prisoners' lives, the tragedy of divided families. Some families became torn between Japan and the Allied nations. One woman in Hawaii, of Japanese heritage, but American by birth, was pressured by Japanese intelligence to spy for them. Instead, she contacted U.S. counterintelligence and reported the approach. Her cooperation helped dismantle parts of a Japanese spy ring on U.S. soil, but it cost her friends, her community connections, and nearly her safety. The emotional toll on these women was immense, yet their stories remain fragments scattered across classified files and buried testimonies. Women who fell in love across enemy lines. Rare but impactful cases exist of Japanese women who fell in love with foreign soldiers, diplomats, or civilians before the war, relationships that became impossible once nations divided. Some used their connections to pass intelligence. Others betrayed their lovers to survive. Still others were caught in the crossfire and punished by both sides. Love became a battlefield with no victors. Not all secret missions were about espionage. Many Japanese women risked their lives simply to protect others, civilians, orphans, refugees, and even prisoners of war. Their bravery rarely appears in history books, but their impact was profound. Women sheltering orphans in China and Southeast Asia. As war ravaged cities across Asia, thousands of children were left homeless. Japanese nurses, teachers, and social workers, often moved by compassion rather than ideology, secretly sheltered these children despite military restrictions. Some forged ration cards, some hid infants in laundry bundles, some passed children to local families under false names. These actions were acts of resistance, wrapped in acts of mercy. Japanese nuns and missionaries. Although Christianity was a minority religion in Japan, several Japanese nuns and missionaries operated in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia during the war. Many used religious institutions to protect vulnerable civilians. They forged baptism papers to shield people from Japanese authorities. They smuggled food into prisoner camps. They hid resistance members inside convents. The Kempeitai kept a close watch on them, but could never fully uncover their quiet networks. Their courage flowed not from politics, but from faith and humanity. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, the world celebrated liberation, peace, and the end of tyranny. But for the Japanese women who had operated in the shadows, as spies, couriers, informants, saboteurs, radio operators, and resistance collaborators, the end of the war was not a moment of triumph. It was, instead, the beginning of a quiet, lifelong struggle. They were women caught between worlds, between two nations, between two loyalties, between two identities, between what they had done and who they wished they could become after peace returned. The Allied occupation brought a wave of interrogations, investigations, and political restructuring. Some Japanese women who had served as intelligence assets were questioned by the U.S. Army's Counter-Intelligence Corps, the CIC. Their lives were dissected, their motives picked apart, their emotional histories judged by men who had never lived a day in their world. Some were released without consequence. Some were quietly recruited by the occupation authorities for new intelligence tasks. Others faced stigma within their own communities, branded as collaborators, traitors, or women tainted by the war. For many, the painful truth was that no one wanted to hear their stories. Japan, shattered and rebuilding, wanted to move forward. The Allied nations, focused on reconstruction and geopolitics, had no interest in elevating stories of courage that did not fit the neat victor vanquished narrative. And within the social norms of both sides, the idea of a woman acting as a spy, with agency, cunning, and autonomy, was viewed as too disruptive to the post-war gender order. So their stories faded. Some married, some left Japan forever, some returned home and lived in silence, and some lived with guilt for having helped the war effort, or guilt for betraying it, or guilt simply for surviving when others had not. The war had ended, but for them, the shadows remained. There is a rarely discussed reality of espionage, especially for women. Survival often comes with a lifelong emotional bill. Many of these women had lived double lives, constantly lying, constantly pretending, constantly watching for the slightest slip that might expose them. They carried the aftershocks of that stress, chronic hypervigilance, fear of being watched, shame, suspicion of others, inability to form close relationships. Some wrote quietly in journals, trying to reconcile what happened. Others destroyed everything, photographs, code papers, uniforms, letters, as if burning the past could give them a clean slate. A few confided their stories to their daughters or granddaughters, but even then, only in fragments. Most took the truth with them to their graves. Unrecognized heroes on all sides. The fascinating and tragic reality is this: the Japanese women who served in espionage during World War II cannot be neatly placed into categories of hero or villain. They operated in a world of moral grayness, a world shaped by coercion, patriotism, fear, survival, desperation, and at times, genuine conviction. Some courageously resisted imperialism. Some faithfully served it. Some simply tried to protect their families in a world on fire. But all of them, regardless of side, demonstrated astonishing intelligence, discipline, and resilience, often in conditions far harsher than their male counterparts ever faced, because for a woman in wartime Japan, failure did not just mean execution. It meant dishonor. It meant the destruction of her family's reputation. It meant social exile. It meant becoming invisible in the eyes of her own society. And so these women operated with a level of psychological pressure that is almost impossible to comprehend today. The veil of history. In the decades following the war, historians focused overwhelmingly on male soldiers, male commanders, male politicians, and male spies. Japanese women, Even those with extraordinary wartime roles were pushed into the background. Why? Because their stories complicated traditional narratives. Because they challenged stereotypes. Because they were too difficult to classify. It was easier to ignore them. Easier to pretend they never existed. And so an entire chapter of World War II history, shaped by women working in silence, in danger, in the shadows, remained hidden for nearly 80 years. Only recently have their forgotten stories begun to surface, in declassified intelligence documents, in diaries discovered in abandoned family homes, in oral history projects interviewing elderly women, in scattered references inside military archives, in university research that began piecing together fragments of evidence. These women were ghosts in their own history. But now, finally, the world is beginning to see them. Conclusion: the women who walked in shadows. As we close this documentary, it's worth remembering one truth. Not all World War II heroes carried rifles. Some carried secrets. The Japanese women who served in espionage, whether willingly, reluctantly, or out of sheer necessity, lived in a world of deception, uncertainty, and risk that few of us will ever fully understand. They were spies, couriers, saboteurs, translators, radio operators, double agents, code breakers, informants, and silent resistance fighters. They operated in a time when a single mistake could mean death. They navigated pressures from their government, from the military police, from foreign occupation forces, and from the gender expectations of both Japanese and Western society. Their missions required extraordinary intelligence, emotional control, and courage, and yet, after the war, they faded into silence. This documentary, and the growing research surrounding their lives, serves as a reminder that history is never complete. There are always stories waiting to be uncovered, voices waiting to be heard, and hidden chapters waiting to be brought into the light. The legacy of their shadows, what remains today, is not simply a record of espionage, but a portrait of women forced to navigate the impossible. Women whose loyalty was constantly tested. Women who sacrificed their identities, their safety, and sometimes their humanity, for causes they may not have fully believed in. Women who found ways to resist an authoritarian empire. Women who tried to survive inside it. Their legacy is complex, haunting, and deeply human. They remind us that history is not made only by powerful leaders in grand halls. It is shaped just as much by individuals whose names will never appear in textbooks. Individuals who made impossible decisions in impossible times. Women who walked in shadows so others could live in the light. Closing narration. In the final count, war remembers its generals, but forgets the silent ones who served in the dark. Their stories were never meant to be told, but they exist, in fragments, in whispers, in classified pages, and in the memories of those few who lived long enough to share them. These are the women who moved unseen, the women who carried secrets instead of weapons, the women who shaped history, from the shadows,